Before the documentary begins, I would like to provide a brief in a few lines first on the title, 1,000 Years of War, Power and Plague, the Untold Medieval Secrets They Never Taught You. What if the story you were taught about the Middle Ages was only a fraction of the truth? For 1,000 years, Europe was trapped between collapsing empires, holy wars, and a plague that wiped out millions. But hidden beneath the ruins, there are clues suggesting that this era was not as dark or primitive as we were told. There were sudden leaps in knowledge that appeared out of nowhere. Entire kingdoms vanished without explanation. Powerful groups controlled history, rewriting events to suit their own survival. Tonight we'll step back into a world of fear, faith, and shadowy power. A world where kings bowed to the church, science was treated as heresy, and the line between survival and extinction was one winter away. This is the story of 1,000 years buried under legend, myth, and silence. And it begins with a question. What truly happened after the fall of Rome? Before we go further, take a second to subscribe. More hidden history, ancient mysteries, and untold stories are on the way, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Let us now begin the complete documentary on title, 1,000 Years of War, Power and Plague, the Untold Medieval Secrets They Never Taught You. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not a single collapse, but a slow fading of structure that people had relied on for generations. Roads that once carried soldiers, merchants, and messages across continents became unsafe. Bridges sagged without repair. Markets that had been supplied by distant farms and ports began to shrink as trade routes broke one by one. A citizen of the old empire would have noticed the change not through a dramatic declaration, but in the quiet absence of things that used to be certain. The tax collector stopped coming, then the baker closed his stall, then travelers warned against taking the highway because armed men now claimed it. It was a long dusk. Rome's fall left a question hanging over every household. Who will keep order? Without a central power to enforce laws, families turned inward and sought security through whichever leader could protect them. Over time, this need reshaped society. The idea of citizenship gave way to loyalty based on land and oath. People pledged themselves to local lords in return for protection, food, and the right to work the land. What emerged was not a sweeping plan, but a patchwork of small power centers, each with its own rules. A strong warrior could become a ruler. A weak ruler could lose everything in a single harsh winter. Survival was local, and it often depended on the strength of a single man and his ability to defend a valley, a river crossing, or a cluster of villages. With the weakening of cities and long-distance trade, many communities turned toward faith for direction and stability. The church became more than a religious institution. It offered structure where governments failed. Monasteries acted as storehouses of knowledge, places of healing, and centers of learning. Monks copied texts by hand, preserving fragments of law, history, science, and philosophy that might otherwise have vanished. They tracked the seasons, experimented with farming methods, and recorded events with care. For many people, the church became the only voice that reached beyond the horizon of their village. Priests baptized, married, and buried. Bishops settled disputes and guided moral conduct. Even kings sought approval from religious leaders because power felt unstable without sacred support. Yet fear defined daily life across these early medieval centuries. Forests crept over abandoned farmland, and wild animals returned to places that had once been busy with carts and plows. Rumors of raids traveled faster than truth. People learned to read the wind, to listen for the distant echo of hoofbeats, and to hide valuables in places where intruders would not think to look. Defense became a shared instinct. Villagers built wooden fortifications. Lords raised stone walls. Fortifications were not symbols of pride. They were measures of survival. The Viking raids of the 8th and 9th centuries intensified this sense of insecurity. Sleek longships appeared along coastlines and rivers with shocking speed, striking monasteries, towns, and farmsteads. These attacks were relentless and unpredictable. Wealthy religious houses, once considered safe havens, became prime targets. Monasteries were burned, and their libraries scattered or destroyed. Entire communities fled inland, carrying what little they owned. Even when raids slowed, the memory of fear lingered. People lived with the awareness that safety could vanish overnight. In the midst of this turmoil, a new vision of unity emerged under the rule of Charlemagne. Through military strength, alliances, and reforms, he built an empire that stretched across much of Western and Central Europe. His rule brought a brief sense of order and purpose. Schools were established to educate clergy and administrators. Coins were standardized to encourage trade. Laws were written down and enforced with new consistency. For a moment, it seemed possible that a new Rome was rising. But empires are fragile when they depend on a single leader. After Charlemagne's death, his heirs divided the land. Rivalries broke out, and the unity he created fractured into pieces. The brief feeling of continental stability faded, and Europe slipped back into regional power struggles. Still, not everything was decline. Small but vital advances took root during this period. Agricultural practices improved. A heavier plow allowed farmers to turn the dense, fertile soil of northern Europe, expanding the land that could sustain crops. The introduction of the horse collar gave horses the ability to pull heavy loads more efficiently, increasing productivity. Three-field crop rotation supported growing populations by protecting soil and reducing famine risk. These innovations spread quietly, not through grand announcements, but through neighbors watching each other work. Trade also began to reawaken. Though long-distance routes had shrunk, local and regional markets slowly revived. Villages by river crossings or near old Roman roads turned into gathering spots for merchants and farmers. Goods such as salt, wool, timber, and iron moved from hand to hand, helping reintroduce economic life to areas that had become isolated. As trade increased, towns grew, and with them came more defined laws, councils, and forms of local governance. Knowledge, too, traveled in unexpected ways. While Europe struggled to rebuild, lands under Islamic rule to the south and east preserved and built upon ancient learning. Scholars there studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, translating Greek and Roman works and adding discoveries of their own. Through trade, war, diplomacy, and chance, some of these ideas made their way back into Europe. New words, new tools, and new ways of thinking slipped across frontiers and into the hands of scholars who were ready to learn. By the end of this era, Europe had changed. Fear had shaped communities, but resilience shaped their future. People learned to adapt, to combine fragments of old knowledge with new needs. They built alliances, forged systems of obligation and service, and leaned on faith when reason could not explain hardship. The world was not peaceful, but it was rebuilding itself in small, steady ways. Out of the ruins of empire, a new order was forming, preparing the ground for a transformation that would eventually change the course of history. As Europe moved beyond the early centuries of instability, power began to gather into clearer shapes. Kings sought to extend their authority beyond a handful of villages and fortresses, but they quickly learned that ruling required more than swords. Land, law, and faith had to align. At the same time, the church grew into a force that could stand beside kings, challenge them, or lift them higher than their armies ever could. A third power quietly rose as well, the merchants and guilds who built wealth through trade and skill rather than lineage. These three forces began a long struggle that shaped Europe's identity for centuries. The church's influence became visible in stone. Cathedrals rose in towns that had once been no more than markets beside a river or crossroads. These buildings required years of labor, expert masons, carpenters, glaziers, and a constant supply of funds. As cathedrals grew taller, cities grew around them. They became centers not just of worship, but of life. People gathered in their shadows to trade, celebrate, and debate. Cathedrals displayed wealth, ambition, and belief all at once. They reminded everyone who held the keys to heaven's gate and who claimed the power to guide society's moral direction. Learning found new homes. Universities formed as groups of scholars who taught students eager for knowledge. What began as informal gatherings turned into institutions with charters and rules. Students traveled from distant regions to study law, medicine, philosophy, and theology. These schools helped shape a more literate class capable of serving as clerks, lawyers, and advisors. Knowledge no longer belonged only to monasteries. Arguments sharpened. Reason began to challenge tradition. Teachers consulted works that had traveled through Islamic lands, carrying ideas that Europe had forgotten. The concept of questioning began to grow, quietly at first, but its roots spread. The Crusades shifted Europe's perspective and ambitions. When the call went out to reclaim Jerusalem, thousands answered, driven by faith, opportunity, or desperation. The journey to the East exposed Europeans to cultures that were more advanced in science, trade, architecture, and medicine. Crusaders returned not only with relics and stories, but with spices, textiles, and knowledge. Trade routes that had been dormant reopened, linking Europe to markets stretching across the Mediterranean and beyond. Italian port cities, especially Venice and Genoa, prospered by arranging transport, supplying armies, and trading goods from east to west. Wealth began to move with ships rather than bloodlines. The Crusades also left scars across Europe. During times of upheaval, people turned on communities they did not understand. Jewish populations in many towns faced persecution, sometimes driven by fear, sometimes by greed disguised as piety. The idea of holy war planted a belief that violence could be sanctified. It also hardened cultural boundaries that would take centuries to soften. While some learned from contact with the East, others returned more certain than ever that Europe held the sole truth. Kings attempted to harness the new energy of growing towns and learning. To rule effectively, they needed money, record-keeping, and loyal administrators. Royal courts expanded, writing down laws and judgments to bring uniformity to their realms. Taxation grew more systematic, and censuses counted people not for curiosity, but for revenue and war. Monarchs hired educated clerks from universities rather than relying solely on nobles. This shift threatened traditional power. Nobles who once acted freely found themselves restrained by paperwork and royal authority. Some resisted, demanding recognition of their rights. The balance of power became a negotiation rather than an inheritance. The church did not quietly accept any challenge to its role. It claimed authority over marriage, morality, education, and the souls of rulers and commoners alike. When kings pushed too far, the church responded with spiritual weapons. Excommunication stripped a ruler of legitimacy. Subjects were told they did not have to obey a king cut off from God. Interdicts could suspend religious services across entire kingdoms, pressuring rulers through the faith of their people. Disputes between kings and popes became defining moments. Sometimes kings knelt and asked forgiveness. Other times, armies marched. Both sides knew that whoever controlled belief controlled loyalty, and loyalty was the backbone of power. Wealth flowed increasingly through trade. Markets expanded, and towns grew into cities with stone walls, guild halls, and charters granting degrees of independence. Merchants gained influence by financing construction, lending to rulers, and organizing trade networks. Guilds set standards for crafts, protected members, and trained apprentices. A man could rise through skill rather than inheritance, although the path remained narrow. Banks emerged to handle long-distance trade, and techniques such as double-entry bookkeeping took hold. These financial innovations changed the way people understood value and risk. Money began to shape decisions as strongly as faith or lineage. This rise of commerce brought cultural exchange. New foods, fabrics, and ideas reached people who had once known only what grew in nearby fields. Demand for luxury goods encouraged exploration. Craftsmen improved their tools. Ships became sturdier. Maps grew more accurate. Even as Europe fought wars abroad and argued at home, connections multiplied. People learned indirectly from distant civilizations through merchants, travelers, and translated texts. Change was no longer confined to royal courts or abbeys. It moved through markets and ports like a tide. Despite this growing complexity, tension threaded through society. The church wanted to preserve unity of belief. Rulers wanted loyalty. Merchants wanted freedom to trade. Each pull had a cost. Questions began to surface that made authorities uneasy. Could knowledge contradict scripture? Could a town govern itself without a lord? Could money buy privilege once reserved for birth? These questions did not topple the system, but they cracked it. The cracks would widen in the centuries ahead. By the early 14th century, Europe appeared stronger and more confident than before. Its cities bustled. Cathedrals dominated skylines. Universities debated ideas that blended ancient thought with new reasoning. Kings collected taxes with increasing efficiency. Trade networks stretched across seas and deserts. Yet beneath this progress, the system remained vulnerable. A bad harvest could spark hunger and unrest. A war could drain treasuries. A dispute between crown and church could paralyze a kingdom. Europe had built a more interconnected world, but it had not built a resilient one. Challenges were no longer isolated. A blow to one part could ripple through all. This delicate balance prepared the stage for a profound shock that would expose every weakness at once. The prosperity and movement that had strengthened Europe would also carry something else, a sickness that no wall, sword, or prayer could hold back. Change had brought connection. Connection would now bring catastrophe. The 14th century opened with promise, but it quickly became clear that the stability Europe had built was fragile. After years of population growth, land became scarce and villages pushed into less fertile areas. A series of poor harvests weakened communities already living close to the edge. Famine spread across regions, and with hunger came disease and unrest. The sense of progress that had filled the previous century faded. Families who once dreamed of better futures now struggled simply to survive each season. This strain made Europe more vulnerable than anyone realized. Then came the blow that would reshape the continent more than any war or political struggle. The plague arrived silently, carried along the same trade routes that had enriched cities and connected markets. Ships brought goods and people, and with them came a sickness that moved faster than fear could keep up. It struck ports first, then traveled inland. Entire households collapsed in days. Some towns lost half their population. Others were emptied so quickly that no one remained to bury the dead. Streets that had been alive with trade fell quiet. Fields went untended. The plague stripped away illusions of control and exposed how delicate society had become. Death changed the way people saw themselves and the world. Labor suddenly became valuable. With so many dead, rulers and landowners struggled to maintain their estates. Survivors discovered they could demand higher wages or move to places that offered better conditions. For the first time, ordinary people had leverage. Laws were passed to freeze wages and bind workers to their land, but enforcement was weak and resentment strong. The old social order, built on duty and obedience, bent under the weight of new expectations. Those who had once been powerless began to ask why their lives should return to the way things had been before. Fear pushed communities to search for explanations. Some believed the plague was a punishment for sin. Others blamed foreigners or minorities. Jewish communities were attacked in violent waves of persecution, driven by suspicion, jealousy, and terror. Many fled or were killed, despite having suffered the same losses as their neighbors. Faith was tested. Some turned away from the church, believing it had failed to protect them or offer answers. Others clung tighter to devotion, convinced that only spiritual purity could save them. Religious movements emerged that called for simpler, humbler practices. The church faced pressure to reform, to listen more and command less. The plague also pushed practical change. Cities experimented with measures to control disease. Quarantine became a tool, with ships held away from ports before anyone could disembark. Houses of the sick were sealed. People began to think about disease as something that could be managed through rules and precautions rather than fate. Physicians recorded symptoms and outcomes, comparing notes and debating causes even without understanding microbes. Although their knowledge was limited, the shift toward observation and record-keeping planted seeds for future medical advances. As population slowly recovered, the absence of so many lives created space for transformation. Land that had been overworked could rest. Forests reclaimed abandoned farms, but others were reorganized into more efficient estates. Survivors inherited property, tools, and opportunities that would have taken generations to accumulate under the old system. Many used these gains to improve their lives or invest in trade. Freed from overcrowding and rigid hierarchies, people began to think beyond subsistence. They acquired books, supported art, and paid for education. A new energy emerged that valued human experience, skill, and expression. Art, literature, and thought responded to the trauma of the age. Images of death became common, but so did depictions of everyday life and individual identity. Writers reflected on mortality and meaning with a sharper, more personal voice. People found value in observing the world as it was, rather than relying solely on inherited beliefs. Curiosity spread. Scholars revisited ancient texts with fresh eyes, searching for wisdom that might explain the human condition. Translations and commentary circulated more widely. The hunger to learn was no longer limited to clerics or nobles. Merchants, craftsmen, and even some women sought knowledge that could broaden their understanding or improve their work. Political power shifted as well. Kings who handled the crisis effectively strengthened their rule. Those who failed or demanded too much faced resistance. Parliaments, representative councils, and assemblies gained influence as monarchs needed approval for taxes and war funding. New expectations formed around governance. People began to insist that rulers should listen, consult, and justify their decisions. Though not yet democratic, the idea that authority required consent started to take root. Laws and charters written during this period set precedents that future generations would use to challenge tyranny and claim rights. Conflict did not end. The 100 Years' War between England and France dragged on, shaping national identities and draining resources. Technological innovation altered warfare. The longbow, strategic tactics, and later gunpowder weapons changed the balance between noble knights and common soldiers. The battlefield became a place where skill and discipline mattered more than noble birth. This shift weakened the old warrior aristocracy and set the stage for centralized states with professional armies. Trade revived quickly once the worst of the plague passed. European merchants reached farther, bringing back goods from Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Demand grew for spices, fabrics, precious metals, and art. Banks expanded, credit systems evolved, and wealthy families like the Medici rose through finance and patronage. Money funded not only commerce but culture. Artists, architects, and scholars found support to explore new ideas and techniques. Towns that recovered well became hubs of innovation. Ports that adapted to changing markets thrived. Paper replaced parchment in many places, making books cheaper and easier to produce. Literacy spread beyond monasteries and elite households. Ideas traveled faster. The ability to read gave people access to knowledge that had once been guarded by a few. Schools increased, and education became a path to advancement. The belief that learning could improve society gained ground. By the end of this 1,000-year journey, Europe stood on the edge of a new era. The world that had begun with the collapse of Rome had transformed through hardship, resilience, and unexpected growth. People had endured famine, war, instability, and plague, yet each crisis had pushed society to adapt, question, and improve. Faith remained central, but reason was rising. Power remained contested, but voices outside the aristocracy were growing louder. Connections across continents were expanding. The Middle Ages did not end with a single moment of triumph. It faded out as new ideas, technologies, and perspectives took hold. The printing press, the compass, and the growing spirit of inquiry would soon ignite change that reshaped art, science, exploration, and belief. What emerged was a world more confident, curious, and open than the one that had lived in the shadow of Rome's fall. The 1,000 years that seemed dark, from a distance, were filled with struggles that laid the foundation for everything that came after. 1,000 years reshaped Europe in ways no one living through those centuries could fully see. What began as a world struggling in the shadow of a fallen empire ended with minds turning toward discovery, art, and distant horizons. Yet the same forces that had driven fear and faith through the medieval world did not disappear. They changed form. Power continued to shift. Trade carried more than wealth. Questions once whispered now demanded answers. The foundations laid during these centuries would spark movements that challenged kings, transformed belief, and pushed explorers toward the unknown. If the Middle Ages were a storm, then the next age would be the lightning that followed. What happened next would shake the world so fiercely that history itself would need a new name.